What if the crime didn't start at the front door? What if it started with a search bar? Before Nancy Guthrie vanished. Before the panic. Before the nationwide headlines. There was something chilling happening online. Investigators have now confirmed that Google searches for her home address spiked shortly before her disappearance. Not after the news broke. Not days later. Before. Who was searching? Why were they searching? And was this the digital footprint of a planned crime? In today's world, criminals don't just leave fingerprints. They leave search history. And if someone was looking up her exact location before she disappeared, that changes everything. Tonight on World Crime Watch, we break down the timeline of those searches, what investigators are quietly analyzing, and whether this points to premeditation. Warning disclaimer. This report is based on publicly available information and law enforcement statements. No individual is presumed guilty unless proven in court. If you care about truth, accountability, and the stories that demand answers, subscribe to World Crime Watch and stay with us. Because sometimes, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's a keyboard. You've seen the headlines. You've reported it before. The story of Nancy Guthrie captured attention everywhere. A mother vanishing from her home, leaving a community shocked, a family devastated, and a nation watching with questions no one could yet answer. But now new layers are emerging, and they are digital. Invisible to most, almost imperceptible. Yet for investigators, these traces are a potential roadmap into what happened that day. It began with a spike. Not in the streets. Not in news reports. But online. Investigators noticed that in the days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, there was an unusual pattern. Google searches for her home address increased sharply. These were not casual inquiries. They were precise, targeted, and timely. The searches occurred before the public knew anything had happened, before headlines, before panic. This is where modern investigations intersect with the digital age. Every keystroke, every online query, leaves a potential trail. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, the trail may hold answers to questions the streets alone could never reveal. Who was looking for her? What did they know? And most chillingly, was this the first step in a planned crime? Law enforcement is approaching this with meticulous care. Analysts are sifting through data, IP addresses, devices, timestamps, to determine whether a single individual or multiple people were involved. Each search is a potential piece of evidence, a thread that, if pulled correctly, could unravel the mystery surrounding her disappearance. Yet, this digital lead is also fraught with uncertainty. Online searches can be misleading. They can reflect curiosity, media coverage, or even coincidence. But in the context of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, timing matters. A search made days before an abduction carries a very different weight than one made after news of the event. This is not just theory. It is a modern investigative reality. Criminals today don't leave only fingerprints or footprints. They leave digital fingerprints, the keystrokes and searches that can betray intention, planning, and knowledge. And the investigators tasked with finding Nancy are now navigating this complex digital landscape, piecing together patterns that could point to her abductor or abductors. But what does this mean for her family? For Savannah Guthrie, who has already endured the unthinkable, it means that even as police scale back the visible physical search, the streets, the neighborhoods, the cameras, the investigation never stops. It evolves. It adapts. The massive manpower on the ground may shift to analytical work, long-term digital tracking, and forensic deep dives into the data that existed before Nancy vanished. The stakes are enormous. A single search, a single click, could be a critical clue. And every unanswered question only deepens the sense of urgency. Who was searching? What were they seeking? And most importantly, how did those searches translate into the real-world events that led to Nancy's disappearance? As we continue to track this story, it becomes clear the world we live in now is different. Crimes do not just happen in the physical world. They start in pixels and codes, in keystrokes and digital curiosity, and sometimes the first clues are not the ones that are most obvious. Investigators are asking themselves every day, were these searches made by someone who intended to commit the crime? Were they made by someone curious about an elderly woman's life? Or were they the work of multiple people coordinating something more sinister? No one knows yet, but every lead, every keystroke, every pattern of activity online is being scrutinized. And this is where the narrative shifts, from what we saw on the streets to what we uncover in the invisible trails of the digital world. The truth, it seems, doesn't always walk through the front door. Sometimes it types itself into existence, leaving behind digital breadcrumbs that only the most careful observers can follow. This is why the search for Nancy Guthrie continues, even if the visible efforts scale back. The investigation has entered a new phase, one where the detectives, analysts, and forensic experts are racing against time to make sense of what might be the first clues in this complex puzzle. And for viewers who follow this story, for those who want answers, there is one lesson. In the modern world, you cannot ignore the digital realm. Every search, every click, every piece of information could be vital. As the investigation unfolds, it is clear that this is not just a story about a disappearance. It is a story about the intersection of human behavior and technology, about how a search bar can hold the keys to understanding a crime before it even occurs, and about the relentless work of those determined to uncover the truth. Nancy Guthrie's case reminds us that in today's world, vigilance extends beyond the streets, beyond cameras, beyond neighbors. It extends into the digital footprints we leave behind, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always traceable if someone knows how to look. And that is exactly what investigators are doing. As digital analysts worked behind closed doors, the physical search for Nancy Guthrie intensified across Tucson. Deputies canvassed her neighborhood. Patrol vehicles lined nearby streets. Search teams moved through desert terrain, drainage areas, and open land surrounding the community. Drones scanned from above. 9 units tracked scent trails that faded into uncertainty. Nancy had last been seen near her residence. There were no immediate signs of forced entry released publicly. No confirmed vehicle description. No confirmed suspect. But investigators believed her disappearance was not accidental. Security footage from nearby homes was collected. Detectives went door to door, asking residents about unusual vehicles, unfamiliar faces, late-night movement. Hours of video were reviewed frame by frame. Then came another development. Authorities revealed that surveillance footage showed a masked individual in the vicinity of Nancy's home the night she vanished. The figure's identity was unknown. The timing was under examination. Investigators did not confirm whether the person in the footage was directly connected to Nancy's disappearance, but the image intensified the urgency of the case. A reward for information was announced. It grew as days passed. Public attention increased. Tips flooded in, hundreds, then thousands. Each tip had to be reviewed, verified, or dismissed. Search teams expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Officers combed desert washes and remote areas outside Tucson. Helicopters flew grid patterns overhead. Volunteers joined organized efforts. Despite the scale of the operation, Nancy remained missing. Behind the scenes, coordination extended beyond local authorities. Federal agencies became involved. Digital forensics teams worked alongside field investigators. The spike in Google searches remained under analysis while physical evidence was still being pursued. Days turned into a week. Questions intensified. Was this a targeted abduction? Was more than one person involved? Had Nancy been moved quickly from the area? Law enforcement remained measured in public statements. They confirmed the investigation was active and ongoing. They did not rule out multiple individuals. They did not confirm a suspect. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department addressed reports suggesting the search might be scaled back. Officials clarified that while large-scale ground searches can transition over time, the investigation itself was not ending. Resources would shift as necessary, but the case remained open. Search teams adjusted tactics. Instead of broad sweeps, efforts became more focused. Areas identified through tips or digital correlation received renewed attention. Investigators reviewed vehicle registrations in surrounding areas. License plate readers were examined. Cell tower data was analyzed to identify devices active near Nancy's home around the time of her disappearance. Each layer added complexity. The masked figure seen on surveillance footage became a central question. Detectives analyzed gait, clothing, height estimation, and movement patterns. They compared the footage with other cameras in nearby streets to trace direction of travel. The image was grainy. The face was concealed. No public identification followed immediately. As the second week approached, the tone of the search changed. It was no longer only about wide-scale physical canvassing. It became a fusion of ground investigation and digital reconstruction. Investigators mapped timelines. When was Nancy last confirmed seen? When did the suspicious search activity occur? When did the masked individual appear on camera? What vehicles were recorded in the area during that window? Data analysts layered these elements together. Still no arrest. The reward amount increased again. Officials urged anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. Public attention remained intense. News outlets tracked developments daily. Community members placed ribbons and signs in visible areas. Inside investigative offices, walls were filled with printed maps, timestamps, and still images from surveillance cameras. Digital logs were reviewed repeatedly. Patterns were studied. Some leads went nowhere. Some tips were ruled out. Others required deeper verification. Search efforts continued in targeted zones outside Tucson based on evolving information. Law enforcement did not disclose what triggered these specific searches. Behind every press conference was the same reality. Nancy Guthrie had not been found. The investigation remained active. The digital spike in searches remained under forensic review. The masked figure remained unidentified. And somewhere in that intersection of physical movement and digital trace, investigators believed the answer existed. Weeks had passed since Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The streets that were once filled with patrol cars and search teams had grown quieter. Helicopters no longer circled daily. Media trucks were fewer. But inside the investigation, nothing had stopped. Detectives continued working behind closed doors. The timeline remained pinned to the wall. Every movement, every search query, every tower ping, every grainy frame of surveillance footage. The masked figure. The digital spike. The unanswered space between them. Search operations shifted from visible grids to precision targeting. Investigators revisited desert areas flagged by new correlations in digital data. Specialized teams searched remote access roads again, this time guided by narrower windows of time extracted from device analysis. Every tip was still logged. Every call was still answered. The reward stood as a reminder that someone somewhere might hold the missing piece. Inside the family's world, time moved differently. Each day without Nancy stretched longer than the last. Public hope fluctuated. Headlines slowed. But the absence did not. There were no confirmed suspects announced. No arrest made. No definitive explanation released. Law enforcement maintained that the investigation remained active and evolving. The digital searches that occurred before her disappearance remained under forensic review. Devices were still being examined. Geographic movement was still being mapped. The masked figure seen near her home remained unidentified. And somewhere between those digital traces and the physical world Nancy stepped out into that day, the truth remained suspended. As weeks turned heavier, the emotional weight of the case deepened. A home stood quiet where life once moved normally. A chair remained empty. A routine was broken. The search had begun in panic. It had moved into precision. Now it existed in endurance. Investigators understood that modern crimes do not unfold in straight lines. Sometimes the evidence waits. Sometimes the breakthrough comes from a detail overlooked in the beginning. A timestamp re-examined, a device reprocessed, a tip revisited. The case had not gone cold. It had gone silent. And silence, in investigations like this, can be deceptive. Because while the streets may appear calm, the work continues in data centers, in forensic labs, in interview rooms. Every byte of information is preserved. Every movement remains stored. Digital footprints do not fade easily. Nancy Guthrie's name had become more than a headline. It had become a question echoing through a community. Where is she? For her family, the question is not procedural. It is personal. It lives in the quiet moments. In the waiting. In the space between phone calls. In the hope that refuses to completely let go. There are cases that explode loudly. And there are cases that settle into a heavy stillness. This one now lives in that stillness. But the timeline remains. The search history remains. The masked shadow in the footage remains. And investigators continue to work that narrow intersection, where digital intent may have crossed into physical action. Until that intersection produces a name. Until it produces an answer. Until it brings Nancy home. The story is not over. It is waiting.
If you want to stay updated on true crime stories, investigations, and in-depth reports like this one, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every story matters, and by subscribing, you help us continue to bring the truth to light.